Good evening. Welcome to the Boston Public Library's Local and Family History Lecture Series. As part of our program, we want to read the following statement to bring attention to the land which we use for our building and events. We acknowledge that the Boston Public Library's Central Library stands on land that was once a water-based ecosystem, providing sustenance for the indigenous Massachusetts people, and is a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. We are committed to land acknowledgements for all locations at which we operate. We reaffirm this commitment to set the context for our planning, deliberations, and public engagement, which will take place from a spirit of welcome and respect found in our motto, Free to All. Tonight, we are very pleased to have James Sullivan here to talk about his book, Unsinkable, 5 Men and the Indomitable Run of the USS Plunkett. James Sullivan was born and raised in Quincy, Massachusetts, and has an MFA from the Iowa Writers' Workshop. He has written for the New York Times and National Geographic Traveler, the magazine. He lives with his family outside Portland, Maine, 3.4 miles from the birthplace of film director John Ford, who steamed onto the Omaha Beach on the Plunkett. Please mute your phones before the program starts. This program is being recorded, and questions will be taken at the end of the program. Copies of the book will be for sale after the program. Thanks for coming, and enjoy the lecture.
Thank you, Diane. All right. Well, I'm happy to be here in Boston. Seems a natural place for this story, and a natural place for me. It kind of feels like a family reunion. There are a half a dozen of you that I don't know, but I'll meet you later, I'm sure. This is, I think, this book came out about 16 months ago. And because we were in the middle of the pandemic, there was no going around and doing any of this like this, which is what usually happens. But there was Zoom, and so there was a lot of Zoom. And I think I did 50 different Zoom events, and then I couldn't do them anymore. I think, Diane, didn't you say you have the option of doing this via Zoom? Enough with the Zoom. I think it was over the top for me when I was doing the Zoom to a Rotary Club in California, and I'm in the midst of the drama of what's going down with the Plunkett, and the faces are, streaming by at the top, and they're moving, and here comes this one guy, maybe he's 77, head knocked back, mouth wide open, eye closed. So took a little bit of steam out of the ship, but I plowed on and got to the end of it. So I'm not going to read from the book because I always get bored. I go to a reading, somebody's going to read for 45 minutes. I'm just like, when is it going to be over? So I never do that. But I'll talk to you about how the book came together and talk about some of the men who are central to the story and talk a lot about the story. There's going to be a spoiler toward the end of it. Can't quite help it with the story in order to bring it full circle. And then, as Diane said, if you have any questions. It's funny, when you publish a book, one of the things that happens is the publisher will send you mock-ups of the cover. And I said to them, Scribner is the publisher. And I said to my editor, Colin Harrison, I said, the only thing I want to say about the cover is, I said, this is a story about 5 men. And I said, and it's really not, it's not a military history. It's a family history first. And the men are the most important part of the story. And Colin got it. He understood completely where I was at. He had sent me this book that Scribner had published about Winston Churchill. It was beautiful, this profile of a man and this really nice cover. And I said to him, the only thing that I'm going to ask about the cover is, I don't want the ship on the cover of the book. So it comes in, and this picture is of the Plunkett that was painted after the fact by a renowned nautical painter. And they took that, and they ran with it, and they listened to me. They heard what I said, but it didn't matter. And I'm happy with it. I mean, when the cover came in, my agent on the book, he was thrilled with it, and Scribner was thrilled with it, and I get it. I mean, a book like this, you put it in a bookstore or in the military history section, and people are going to say, oh, well, I'll go and get this. Military history is in many ways a more alluring fodder for subject, fodder for a book than family history. But for me, this is family history. Last summer, I read Frank McCourt's book, Tis. There are 3 of them, and each one is as good as the last. They're so good. And he was celebrated for the first one, Angela's Ashes, of course. And then he did Tis, that was the follow-up. And the third one was Teacher Man. And Frank McCourt was a public high school teacher in New York at Stuyvesant and some other big-time high schools. And toward the end of his teaching career, he was talking to this class of students, and he said to them, he had them in front of them, and he says, sit with your grandmother. Let her tell her story. All the grandmothers and grandfathers have stories, and if you let them die without taking down your stories, you are criminal. That's just Frank McCourt. He's like that, he's over the top. He's gonna, but that resonated for me because I think that, as a kid growing up, as just about all of you know, I love listening to all the old stories. And Patrick and I just were yesterday volleying pictures of our great-great-grandfather, yours too, your great-great-great-grandfather, who was in the frontier cavalry out in the West in the 19th century. We did this iconic family photo. So that's where this began for me, is with that. And not only in general with that story, but one in particular. But before I get to that, I'll just play the little movie that was made at the beginning of when the book came out. And the voice is Don Snyder, who's a writer of some renown. He's got a great voice for this, certainly better than mine was going to be.
On January 21st, 1944, at 1300 hours, deckhands on the USS Plunkett hauled anchor as the crew made preparations to get underway. On the bridge, Captain Ed Burke checked orders that called for his destroyer to proceed to the vanguard of a convoy that included 38 landing craft. In the forward fire room, water tender Jim Phelps lit the number 2 and number 4 boilers, readying the ship's power plant. On the highest part of the ship, gunnery officer Ken Brown squeezed through a hatch in the fire control director to join 5 other men who would manage the ship's battery of 5-inch guns. And in the number 3 gun tub, John Gallagher leaned over the apron of the 20-millimeter gun he manned at general quarters and looked back into the convoy, wondering which of those landing craft carried his brother Frank, a medic in the 5th Army who'd be going ashore in the first wave. The sailors on Plunkett were old hands at getting underway. They'd come into the war at Casablanca more than a year earlier and had been steaming toward the red-hot center of it ever since. They'd come under aerial assault for the first time at Gela in Sicily. After 36 straight hours at general quarters, they wrote in their diaries that it was a day they'd never forget. Soon enough, that day would become a day just like any other, and then they would get worse. The Maddox went down with 211 of her crew in that first invasion off Gela. They'd seen the Rowan hit in the Gulf of Salerno and watched her go down with 202 men in less than a minute. More than 200 were killed when a glide bomb barreled through 5 of Savannah's decks. In October, a German sub torpedoed the destroyer Buck, killing 163 and Plunkett ran at flank speed for 2 hours to pick up survivors. The depths of this war were tugging at them like a whirlpool, and the bombs were falling closer and closer. What they could not know, as they made fast their anchor on the afternoon of January 21st and started north from Naples through the Tyrrhenian Sea, was that they were steaming toward a rendezvous with the German Luftwaffe, the likes of which no U.S. Navy ship had ever seen or would see through all of World War II. It was to be a battle so savage and so relentless, it was a wonder that any of them would survive. This is that story.
The video that was up there is actually of the Plunkett from 1944. It was in the National Archives, and all that video of the men making fast the anchor and hauling the line. In fact, after that went up online, I got an email from somebody who said, "That man in the brown trench coat, that's my grandfather." And like they had no idea that their grandfather had been in this archival footage. And so that was a remarkable thing. So anyway, so family history. So the story, the place this all begins, and I had no intention of writing a book about any of this, but the place that it begins is with the man on the left. That's my grandfather's brother Frank, and that's my grandfather's brother John. These are the Gallaghers in Africa in 1943, and so. The most famous story in my family, I think across all the branches of my family, is the story that Frank used to tell, and that all of us here can tell and have told multiple times until we're blue in the face. And what's he doing now, taking and writing a book with that story? It belongs to us, right? So this is the story that Frank used to tell. John, on Pearl Harbor, he's out at Hemingway Park with my grandfather, little Charlie. And this is what my grandfather would say. John, of course, didn't tell us this, but he's at Hemingway Park. When they get word, he's over there. What did they used to play at Hemingway Park? They played cards and they did stuff. And, little Charlie's out in the stroller there because it's Sunday and he's taking him out. And they found out that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. And that night at midnight, John and his friends Franny Driscoll and Georgie Hurley, they went down to into the post office, the old post office in right down by State Street in Boston. What was it? Is the post office square? They went there, and they called it the Federal Building. And they went at midnight, and they signed up. And this is something that John had written later in a letter, something none of us ever knew because we just found these letters. And so the three of them signed up right away, and off John went. He stayed home for a week or so, but he's off and he's gone. And now there's the draft, and there are 5 Gallagher brothers, and 4 of them end up going away to the war. And Frank gets drafted, and he's a medic in the 5th Army. And now Frank has come into the war in North Africa. John had already been in the war, and now they're getting ready for the invasion of Anzio. It's early 1944, and 36,000 men are going to go into Anzio and Nettuno, these 2 beaches 25 miles south of Rome. And so the staging ground for this is in Naples, Italy. And there are 2 different areas, and Frank's, he's with his unit, and he's outside Naples. And they told him, you can't go into Naples. He knows that the Navy task force that's going to carry all these men up the coast is out there. And he's got an idea that his brother's destroyer is out there. And so he's going to get in there. They say, you can't go into Naples. There's typhus in there. And he says, he doesn't care about typhus. He's going to go in. He thinks he might find his brother. So Frank, being Frank, he picks up an empty jerry can, a 5-gallon jerry can, and he has it filled with Italian red wine. On the way in, he's walking, and he's on the truck. He jumps off the truck. He's going to go find his brother. He's got the jerry can. He's hauling off the jerry can, right? I mean, Frank, if he's got a jerry can of wine on his shoulder, he's hauling off that thing as he's going to find his brother. So he comes in Naples, and he comes in, and he goes to the mole, the big pier. There was a big pier in Naples. Some of you have been there and seen it and walked on this mole. It's a pier, and that's where the flagship for the task force is. This is the ship that's going to coordinate all these Navy vessels out there. And Frank calls up to the sailors on the deck. He says, "Hey, is the Plunkett here?" And they're, they can't identify who's this guy, why is he carrying that thing. They can't tell him, in particular. But they say, yeah, well, it's in the area. So Frank, he says, all right. So he comes off the pier, because there's no way to get from the pier. He sees all the Navy vessels out there. He can't see which one might be the Plunkett. The destroyer has a very telltale silhouette profile. So he goes around into this little neighborhood of Santa Lucia, which is the only place that you can get out into the harbor. Santa Lucia is famous for this song that Italian immigrants brought to America in the early 1900s, and I won't sing it, but there's a famous song. Frank was probably singing it. He gets down there, he jumps into a little bumboat, which is a little wooden boat by an Italian boatman, and let me see if I've got the, this is Naples here, that's the pier. The mole that I was talking about, and Frank can't get out to any because it's these huge breakwater stones. So he's got to get to this little terrace, and this is taken in 44. I'm not sure when. That's Mount Vesuvius up there. So Frank's got the jerry can, and he's got to get out there and see if he can find the Plunkett. And he told this story his whole life. Anytime, Christmas, holiday gatherings, he told it so much. One day I just took out a tape recorder, and instead of me finishing the story...
A little Italian was there at the pier. I jumped in, I said, row up the harbor. And he yelled at me, I said, row up the goddamn harbor. And I get out there, and don't you think I saw the Plunkett?
Yeah.
And I climbed
the harbor's full of ships?
Climbed over the back of it.
Yeah.
I should have been shot dead. I had a can. It could have been a mine or anything.
Yeah.
You're supposed to, I don't know anything about the Navy, you're supposed to go to the gangplank, walk up, salute the flag, and ask permission to board.
Yeah.
So then the captain called General Quarters, they call it. These Navy terms I never do. Now, there's about 250 sailors on a destroyer. They're all up on the bridge and down and everything. I'm standing with the car keys in my 5-gallon can of wine, and he's blasting the shit out of him. John looked at me, that looks like my truck. Oh, geez, and he came down, the captain was all right. His name was Burke. He said, get down and bunk with your brother there. We find out what we're going to do with you and everything else. So I had beer and everything else. The captain had kept the wine. I didn't give a shit with you. That's bigger than your house of wine.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they got a red alert, they call it. They're alerted. Now they're going for the invasion.
Oh, yeah.
And they put me ashore about 11 o'clock at night.
So that's Frank's story. That's the one that we heard all, year in, year out, and you never got tired of hearing it. I mean, you can hear the personality. I recorded that in Dorchester on Flavia Street, probably in 1998. I just brought it over. My grandfather had just died, and I had recorded a lot of stories from him, and I thought, well, I got to go get Frank now because he's got some good ones. So I got that with Frank, and so that's where this whole thing began. And this is all we kind of ever knew about what had happened to John Gallagher on the Plunkett. We knew that story, and of course we knew what happened in the end, but we really didn't know, what transpired otherwise. When did he come aboard, and what happened before, the ship's defining moment. That was all sort of lost to us. I think my grandfather probably knew some of it, a lot of it, but from generation to generation, you just sort of forget things. And so in 2016, I was heading over to Italy with my mother and my brother and my wife and our kids, and we were going to go to Rome. We're going to go to Florence, and we're going to go to Venice. And I wanted to go to Pompeii because, Pompeii, right? Who doesn't want to see Pompeii? But it's so far from Rome. It's a long day trip. I was still ready to do, I'll go down and back. But my wife, the veto, I'm not going to do this. I know we're going to be dragged through, churches and cathedrals, and, we're going to listen to the Rick Steves, and, so it's not going to be all day down to Rome and coming back again. So, and the kids, at the same time, they're thinking, they know me and, where we're going to go. And can't we go to one beach over there? I remember Cullen he's looking on the desktop, and, he's looking, and here's some beaches right near Rome. Why can't we go to these? And then it dawns on me that Anzio is right there. And Anzio is this huge name in our family history. Anzio, because Frank and John were there during this pivotal battle during the Second World War. And I'm thinking, well, of course we've got to go to Anzio. And in fact, the whole trip pretty much became about getting to Anzio for me as soon as it dawned on me that we had to. It wasn't where it started, but that's where it ended up. And so then I began to think, I wonder, this is 2016, you do the math. If you're born in 1925, you were 18 in 1943, you'd be 91 today. I'm thinking, are there any men still alive who had been on the Plunkett? This is what I'm thinking as we're going into this trip. So I'll tell you a little bit more about what I found out about that after I tell you about this ship, because this is the Plunkett. You can see the hull number there, 431. I don't think any of us knew that the Plunkett, we all knew the Plunkett. I mean, that word in my family, there was a sort of, when we said that word, there was almost something religious about it because of what happened on this ship and because of the stories that were told about it. And so I don't think we ever knew that the Plunkett was getting its first 15 minutes of fame in 1940 when Popular Science came out to detail this new kind of destroyer that had come on, the Benson Gleaves class had come online in the U.S. Navy. We were not into the war yet, but this was going to be the nimble ship that was going to do everything. So the Plunkett got its first 15 minutes of fame here on a magazine cover. And later in the war, and I'll talk about this a little bit if there's time, it went into Omaha Beach on D-Day. And who's on the Plunkett but the film director John Ford, who was famous for How Green Was My Valley and The Informer. Later he did The Quiet American. He was a chief petty officer in the Navy. And the Plunkett took Ford into Omaha Beach, and there's all sorts of debate about what Ford did when he got to Omaha Beach. And there are stories that emerge from the men on the Plunkett about what Ford was doing, and I can talk about those again later. But this is a ship that, was cutting a pretty interesting profile. Here it is in the magazine. It's, it's going into Omaha Beach with John Ford. I'm reading one day, as in 2016, I'm starting to read like crazy about this. I'm reading Herman Wouk, The Winds of War, which is an incredible book about the Second World War. It's a big sort of James Michener-esque look at it. And 700 pages into the book, one of the naval officers gets on a ship, and it's the Plunkett. It's fiction, but the Plunkett had, maybe because Herman Wouk, who was a naval officer during the war, had seen this. Anyway, he found the Plunkett, so the Plunkett kept. So all the stars are starting to line up on this thing that's going on in early 2016. So here's what you need to know about the destroyer. There are 5 iconic ships of the U.S. Navy, and if you've played Battleship, you know what they are. You've got the destroyer, you've got the cruiser, the battleship, the aircraft carrier, and the submarine. And the destroyer is the smallest of the bunch, and the size of a destroyer is measured in tons. 1,650 tons was the size of the destroyer. What that measures is that the ship displaces 1,650 tons of water. That's how heavy it is. Now, a battleship displaces 40,000 tons. So a battleship is going to be, 20 times larger than a destroyer. They were built light to go fast. That hull on the ship is only 3/8 of an inch thick, and they were called tin cans because of that. And there were about 250 to 270 men on the Plunkett. At Anzio, Plunkett had 265 men. there were 13 of the ship's officers. It's funny, in the Navy, men are enlisted men, and the officers are not men, they're officers. And so you had the 13 officers, and then because the Plunkett was the flagship for the squadron, there were another 7 officers on the Plunkett. So that ship, as long as a football field plus most of its end zones, it goes 37, 38 knots at flank speed, which is the top speed for a ship. And that's about 44 miles per hour, which is as fast as a racehorse. So think of the ship as big as a football field. It's got almost 300 men on it, and it's moving over open ocean water as fast as a racehorse. So that's the destroyer, and it's a beautiful ship. I mean, the lines on it, from an aesthetic perspective, it's just a beautiful ship. I often think of it as the quintessential ship of the imagination. If you think of, a Navy ship, that's kind of the first one that pops up into mind, even more than the submarine's kind of ugly, flat top of a carrier. This has all the classic lines. If Hollywood is going to make a movie about a Navy ship, that's what you're thinking about. That's what you're looking at. And the function of its destroyer, it's the first ship in harm's way. It's kind of like the grunt on point in the jungle, the Minuteman behind the stone wall. That was the destroyer's job. In the beginning of the war, what it did, its principal job was to mine the convoys and that were moving material across the Atlantic to England as part of the Lend-Lease program. We're not into the war for a couple of years. The Germans invaded Poland in September of 1939, and we're still, we're not sure we want any part of this. Half the country wanted to get in, half didn't want it. Roosevelt had to mind his time. He couldn't get out in front of everybody. He had to wait for everybody to catch up. Everybody was going to catch up on December 7th, 1941. But for the first 2 years of World War II, we're not an active part of it, but we're supporting our allies. So that's what Plunkett is doing in the beginning. It is minding these Liberty ships. They used to cross the ocean in these columns. There'd be 40 ships in 5 columns. 8 ships in a row, and the destroyers would just they'd be all around the edge, and it was their job to guard against incursion by submarine. So they are listening with sonar. And they're looking, because they've got their lookouts all over the deck of the ship with binoculars. They're looking for planes and the submarines who want to attack this convoy. So that's what the destroyer did in the beginning. It had, in that video, those guns that were firing were the 5-inch guns. In terms of the guns that were on the ship, you had, on the center line of the ship, you had 4 5-inch guns. These are the big guns that would go after the dive bombers coming down. And the 5-inch shells weighed 52 pounds. And these are the shells that are pumping out, was in the video, that are going after the dive bombers. You've got, around the fringe of the ship, you've got gun tubs. And in the gun tubs, you've got 20 millimeter guns. And these guys can't get the dive bombers. They can go after the planes that are close. So the torpedo bombers that sweep in low and drop their torpedoes when they get a bead on the hull of a ship, those are what the 20 millimeter guys are going after. So you've got those 6 guns. Then you've got the 1.1-inch gun on the Plunkett, and that was that could go after the dive bombers, and it could go after the torpedo bombers. So that's the way the ship was set up in terms of gunnery. So in the beginning, they're minding the convoys. As the war gets underway now, they are now part of the task force. There were 6 invasions in North Africa and in Europe during the Second World War. The first one was at Casablanca, and that was in November of 1942. This is the Plunkett here, shortly after it was built in Kearney, New Jersey. There's that fantail that Frank climbed up on. It's just 4.5, 5 feet above the waterline. So that first invasion is going to be at Casablanca. Let me see, what else did I wanted to show you these big gun turrets here. They call them mounts too, with the single barrels. Those are the 5-inch guns. There are 2 in the front, and then there are 2 in the back, pointing in the back. And then the gun tubs, are these little aprons that jut out. You can't really see them. In fact, they may not even be on the ship at this point because it was just going through its trial runs. So you have the gun tubs around the fringe of the ships, and those are the 5-inch gun mounts. The director, which controlled all of the guns on the ship, that's not on there either. That's up the top. So Casablanca is in November 1942, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But first of all, the men, I was talking about the ship, about the men on the ship, 250 men. This picture is not a picture that we ever had in my family. And when I began to do the research for this, I visited with one of the men that I'll talk about in a bit. And I walked into his room in his house outside St. Louis, and he had this room that was like a shrine to the Plunkett. And I walked in there, and I look at this picture on the wall, and it's just a beautiful picture of these men. I mean, it looks like something out of a movie. These naval officers, these glamorous women, and these are the sailors on the Plunkett, on the roof of the Hotel St. George in Brooklyn, March 19th, 1943. And I look at this, and I said to the sailor, Jim, Jim, are you in this picture? He says, yeah. He points out himself in this picture, and he says, of course, that's Captain Burke. And I said, is John Gallagher in this picture? He says, no, I don't. Johnny's not in that one. And I'm looking, and I'm looking, and I'm looking, and I said, that's John Gallagher, right there, behind the woman with the big hair. And this is Eddie Burke, the captain of the ship, and that's Ken Brown up there behind the little boy like. That's Ken Brown and his first wife, who I was not allowed to write about in this book. So there are three of the guys central to this story. And, at this point, I'm still not sure why I'm doing all this research, except that, this is a really interesting story, and I'm really curious about it. But again, all these sort of stars are lining up. When I saw Burke and John Gallagher, and who's that woman he's with? And then there's Ken Brown, and this wife that I'm not going to be able to write about. And then there's Jim Phelps way in the back. So this is the old guy. So now I'm going to Italy now. And we are, and I'm thinking, is there anybody still alive who was on the Plunkett during the war? And I go to a website, and I saw that the last reunion for the Plunkett was in 2011. And there's a man's name at the bottom of the page and a phone number, and so I call it. And I call him. His name's Ted Mueller. He's an old timer. He's in his 90s, and I call and I tell him I'm interested in the story of the Plunkett. Can you tell me a little bit about your time on the ship? And he had been on the ship. He came on the ship after Anzio, and I told him that I had a relative who'd been on the ship at Anzio, and was there anybody still alive who was on the ship at Anzio? And he said, well, yeah, I know this one fella. His name's Jim Phelps, really nice fella. And he said, he'll talk to you about it. So he gives me his two phone numbers. He's got the home phone, he's got the cell phone. And so I call the home phone. I get a machine. I thought, I'll try the cell phone, right? I call him. It's a Saturday morning. And I catch him. He's at a home show, which is, I still love telling this story about catching Jim at a home show, because I'm thinking, he's 91. What's he doing at a home show? Walking aisles, What's he going to do? He's gonna, do a new backsplash? He's looking for tile. And so I get him, and I talk, and I say the magic word out loud, the Plunkett. And he just starts talking, and I'm listening to him, and I can tell. You know how you can tell if someone's a really nice person just from the tenor of their voice? And you can hear that in Jim Phelps right away, as old as he is. And so he goes on, and he starts telling me about this. He's almost on automatic, He's just, no one's asked him about the Plunkett. Certainly no one, calling from the East Coast. And, I'm not 90-something. Why am I interested in it? And he said, look, I'm at the home show, but I'll be home tomorrow. Can you call me tomorrow at home? I said, of course I will. And I said, before I let you go, I just want to tell you why I'm interested in the Plunkett. I didn't tell him in the beginning, and I'm glad I didn't, because I wouldn't have got this reaction. I said, look, the reason I'm calling is because my grandfather's brother, John, my grandfather's brother was on the ship, and his name was John J. Gallagher. And so I said the words, and then I listened to the silence. It goes on, and I'm listening, and I'm thinking, ooh, the call dropped? Or no, I'm thinking, this is 75 years ago. He's trying to remember. He's a nice guy, doesn't want to disappoint me. And so then his voice comes back to me, and I know that the first thing I thought I could hear the smile in his voice as big as the moon, and he goes, Johnny Gallagher was a very good buddy of mine. And I think there were tears in his eyes. He told me later, because there were tears in my eyes, and then I called you, and I think there were tears in your eyes. It just, it was like, and then I thought, I'm just doing this, because I'm curious, but now I feel obliged. Like, now things are really starting to get, I got to do more. This is Jim Feltz here in Overland. So now this story is coming together, where, Frank's story, not only is, Frank's story a real thing, but there are men still alive who were on the Plunkett. And Jim Feltz, he's the first of the men that I really connected with. And I'll tell you a little bit about his story, because this is the town he grew up in, Overland, Missouri, just outside St. Louis. And he drops out of school in 10th grade. His mother said to him, Jimmy, you're not dropping out of school unless you get a job first. So his buddy Norman broke his arm. Norman had a job stocking shelves at the Five and Dime, Mr. Siegel's. And so Jim said, Norman, can I have your job? Because I got to drop out of school. I can't drop out of school unless my mother. So Norman gave him the job. He goes to Mr. Siegel. Mr. Siegel hires him. His mother signs off on it, and he goes to work. He's a stock boy. That's what he does. He keeps the inventory in his head. Jim was going to be really good at those sorts of things, and he was good at that job. And he was a kid of great integrity who grew into a man of great integrity. And there was a woman who worked in the store who was 6 years older than Jim. Her name was Mickey. And Mickey had a niece who was just 6 years younger than she was, same age as Jim, actually a year younger than Jim. And she wants to connect Jim with Betty because she really likes Jim as a sort of a young brother. She had her own boyfriend. And Betty wants nothing to do with Jim. First of all, he can't dance. He won't even try. He's bashful. And she's kind of already glamorous. She's in a business school. He's a high school dropout, and he's a stock boy. And nice kid, but he can't dance. So weekend after weekend, Mickey is insisting on the development of this relationship. And so she's taking him out to the movie theaters. And I know all this because at some point along the journey here with Jim, I went out to visit him several times. He tells me about these letters that they wrote. And I said, Jim, you talk about these letters. He says, well, there's nothing in them. And I said, can I just take a look at what you have? You said you saved them. I'd love to see. I love those old style envelopes. I'm like brown nosing them. The old envelopes. I don't want to read them, right? I just want to see what you've got. So he brings me into this closet, and he's got like 300 letters from the war that he and Betty exchanged. I said, Jim, can I read a couple? He said, Betty wanted me to burn these. You want to read them? Put them in a book? I said, well, he said, but sure, take them. And so this is how I know so much of this stuff. She admitted to I know I was really mean to you when we just started. She's 17 years old now, and she's writing, and then, sort of things happen. So he doesn't dance, right? And not only did he not dance, but her father didn't think much of Jim, liked him, but he's a stock boy at the Five and Dime. And she's at secretarial school. She's going places. He's going to stock the shelves. And so he's got these two things against him, but they came together. And then the war comes, and it's 1942. They've been together now for a year. He's 17 years old, and he goes back to his mother. He says, Ma, can you sign another paper for me? She says, I signed it at the Five and Dime. And he says, yeah, but would you sign this other one so I can join the Navy? No, I'm not signing that. He said, Ma, in the Navy, you get a bunk and you get a hot meal, and I won't have to carry a gun in the Army. Signs the paper. So in 1942, the spring of 42, Jim takes off to the Great Lakes for boot camp in 42, and that's him at the end of his boot training. This was him at 92. and that's him 75 years earlier. You can see it. You can see it's the same man. So now I've got one of Johnny Gallagher's close friends, and then there's a story is sort of coming together in my imagination, and he starts talking about Eddie Burke, who's the captain of the Plunkett. And Ed Burke is already a legend. He was born in 1907 outside Wilkes-Barre, this little coal mining town. His grandfather was an Irish immigrant, worked in the coal mines. His father started out in the mines, climbed up out of the mines, worked on the streetcars, and then became a justice of the peace, sort of a semi-professional. But he never moved his family out of this little neighborhood where all the coal miners lived. And so Eddie Burke grew up fighting all the time. He had 5 sisters in this hymn. And so he was fist fighting all the way through his boyhood. And he turned out to be, a 6-foot light heavyweight. He boxed at Annapolis. In his senior year at the Palestra in Philadelphia, he went to the finals for the light heavyweight championship, and he lost to this guy O'Malley from MIT. He also played football. That's Ed Burke with the eye of the tiger looking at his opponent at Soldier Field in 1928 before, it wasn't the Army-Navy game. I think it was Navy Notre Dame, because for some reason they weren't playing the Army that year. But 110,000 people, the largest sporting event in the history of the world up until that time. So Burke, what's important to know about Burke is on the football team, he played offense and defense at the same time. That was going to be very important later in this story. So now I've got these 3 men, and each of them is compelling, and I'm still calling, because now I'm a little bit crazy about what might still be out there, and so I'm calling all the time now on the phone, and I'm getting, just like a telemarketer, I'm showing up on people's phones. They pick up the phone, they're going to hang up on me. I'm blurting the word Plunkett as fast as I can if I hear an old voice, hoping that might keep the door open. So I found out about this, the gunnery officer on the Plunkett, this man Ken Brown. I found his obituary, and I read the obituary, and I saw the name of a daughter, Karen Fratnaro, in Costa Mesa, California. So up to Google and easy to find, right? Only going to be one of her in that town. And so I call her and I tell her, I leave a voicemail on her phone. Can she talk to me about her father's time during the war? Did he, leave anything to you? And she calls me back the next day and she says, it just so happens I'm sitting here with my father right now. And I'm thinking, I thought he's dead. And she says, it turned out that was, the obituary was for her brother who had died, and her father was still alive. I just presumed he was dead, because he was 95. So that was Ken Brown, the gun boss, and he's got this great voice. It's almost like his vocal cords are lined with granite. And I hear this baritone voice, this deep voice on the phone, and he's really sharp. And he starts talking to me about the Plunkett story. And pretty soon I've got a 4th guy, and I'm thinking, now I've got these 4 men, and Ken has all this stuff, these photos and letters and memories and these stories. And he married a woman who, was modeling in the 1940s in Manhattan. And that is not the wife in the picture. This is the other one. And, haven't things gone south? Haven't things in America gone south since women stopped putting cotton balls on their head? I mean, look at that. What a hat. Anyway, so I met her as an old woman, and she was as beautiful in her 90s, I'd say, as she was there. So now I've got these 4 people. I better check the time, because you'll be here in 3 hours. 10 till? Oh, okay. All right. I'll speed it up now, and you can read the rest of the book. You've already read the book. Anyway, so this is Ken Brown, and so Jack Simpson was the 5th man. He was he was Ken Brown's first roommate. He's still alive. He's down in Atlanta. He sounds just like Jimmy Carter on the phone. And he was the first lieutenant on the ship. So I've got these two officers and Jim Phelps, these three men, and they're telling me about the Plunkett, and they're filling it in. And all of a sudden I start hearing all these things. You know, all I know is Frank's story, but now I'm hearing about the invasion at Casablanca and how the Plunkett, you know, the invasion at Sicily, and then the invasion of the Italian mainland at Salerno, and the invasion at Anzio. And then the Plunkett is on Omaha Beach, bringing John Ford into Omaha Beach, scraping the hull in the sand almost. And then they're in the invasion of in southern France. It's the only Navy ship to participate in every single engagement or amphibious landing during the Second World War. And not only that, and this is something that we didn't know, the Plunkett the Plunkett experienced during the war the most harrowing engagement between a U.S. Navy ship and the German Luftwaffe during the Second World War. That's what happened at Anzio. That's where this whole book is going. That's where the story's going. So the first of the invasions, I'm going to talk just a little bit here about you know, what happened in the beginning. We'll jump to what happens at the end and leave it there. So this is another one of those things. This photo was in the photo album that was in the Gallagher family. And, you know, we just had this one. And 11/29/1942, Liberty at Casablanca. On November 29th, 1942, in Manhattan, the Free French marched down Fifth Avenue in New York. The Free French marched singing the Marseillaise, which is their national anthem. They marched to the Hollywood Theater in Manhattan because that night, November 29th, 1942, there's a new film with Bogart and Bergman premiering at the Hollywood Theater. You know what that was, right? Casablanca. Yeah. And these guys are in Casablanca. That day, you know, no Rick's Cafe, right? But that day, they go out and they're out on the studio. They go out and they go to the studio. And I told Jim Phelps, I said, Jim, I've got this photo. I haven't met him yet, right? So I got this photo, and I got these men, these 5 men. I think they have to be off the Plunkett. It's Liberty at Casablanca. And I said, I'd like to send it out to you and see if you recognize anybody that's in there, because one of them is my great uncle. And he says, well, tell me about that photo. And he said, well, it's in a studio. There's 5 men standing in a line, little French kid. And he says, oh, I got that one too. I said, oh, how come you have that one? He says, I'm the guy behind the French kid. so it began, you know, here comes the evidence. John Gallagher is right in there, second from the left. Jim Phelps is second from the right. That's Zacharewski in the middle with the gun belt on, because he was on shore patrol. And then, let's see, they called him Ski. That's McNellis is on the far left, and Irv Gebhardt is on the far right. And not only was there this photo, but there were 2 others. They had pulled in a couple of young Arab boys in the local garb, and they had them sit down. And then they brought in these dark-skinned foreign sailors and a couple of Army guys who almost looked photoshopped in. So these guys, they're just on a lark. They're pulling everybody into this. This is the first invasion of the war. And they are, you know, in Casablanca now, having their pictures taken. You know, this is what it was like. This is John Gallagher from Dorchester, right? He's in Africa all of a sudden. What a big shot! Let me get some pictures. So they came into to Casablanca on the second wave. So they were part of the invasion, but it was the second wave, and there wasn't a lot of action on the second wave. There was a real fire away Flanagan at the beginning with the first wave. But over the next 5 months, the Allies rolled across North Africa. You know, the army fought Rommel, and we beat the Germans, right? North Africa in May, I think, of '43. Plunkett, meanwhile, is back and forth to the States. But they are underway in the war now. And this is when the war really kicks into the story. So in the book, there's a lot of that build-up to this. This is when it begins. These guys, in their journals, they are at Casablanca, which was known as the Ice Cream Front, and you know, because everything had been pacified by then, and they really want to get into the thick of it. And so they get their wish at Gela, the invasion of Sicily. We're going over in July of 1943. The Allies decide that they're going to mount this first invasion of Europe. It's not the mainland, but it's Sicily. And so there are 3 invasion points on the south part of Sicily, and Plunkett goes in at Gela. And this is actually a photo from that invasion, the anti-aircraft fire going up, and Navy ships all around on the invasion. So this is when the war begins for them. And they are very quickly in the thick of it. They go from Sicily on the second invasion. It took 32 days to take Sicily for the Germans. The Allies literally pushed the Germans right off Sicily, out Messina. They chased them all the way down along the north coast of Sicily, including Cefalù, that little town that we went to. And the Plunkett was right there. You got Patton on shore, and Patton is moving his army toward Messina, chasing the Germans, and the Plunkett and other ships are there. They're doing these leapfrog. These leapfrog maneuvers, and Plunkett and the other ships are bombarding, and Patton on the ground is pushing them. Patton didn't believe much in Navy bombardment until Sicily, and then he believed it, and absolutely, because the Navy really proved what they could do. So that was Sicily. The third invasion of the war in Europe was at Salerno, and that's where Frank came into the war. Frank comes into North Africa, but he had missed all the fighting in North Africa. In the summer of 1943, he is in Oran, which is in Algeria today, and John found him. This is before Frank found John. John found out that his brother's unit was up in Iran, and so he took a truck from Mers El Kabair, where the Plunkett was, over the hill, and he found Frank sleeping like a dog on the ground in a tent, which is, I'm sure, what he probably reminded him. He had a bunk, and they had that picture that was up at the beginning. They had that picture. Frank just wrote Africa, 1943. And part of the fun to the research on this book was figuring out where that was, and triangulating from deck logs in the Plunkett. I was able to figure out exactly where that was, and then you find other corroborating things. So, anyway, all of this leads up. I'm going to skip all the parts about the Newfoundland and about the Plunkett shooting down its first couple of planes, and about the Buck, which is an amazing story about when they went at flank speed out to rescue men on another destroyer that had been torpedoed by a German submarine. I'll skip that. I'll skip the part about how the guys in the Plunkett took an island of Ustica off the Italian coast. So they're in the middle of it, and the war is just like a whirlpool now, and these guys are really in the thick of it. And there was this one point, right at the end of the research, after I'd pretty much written all of the book, I came across these letters that had been in Squantum on Crabtree Road at a cousin's house, Carol Keneally. She called me one day. She'd been going through her brother's thing. She says, "I found these letters that John Gallagher wrote to my mother because they were friends. They all came from the same corner in Dorchester." And she said, "Do you want me to send them up to you?" She said, I said, "Well, yeah." I said, "Look, I'll come down and get them." She said, "No, I'll send them up. I'll send them up overnight mail. I'm leaving the next day to go fishing." And I thought, I'm going to cancel the trip. I'm not going. And I ended up going, but I didn't catch a fish, because I kept thinking about the letters. I knew the letters were there. I've been writing about this guy now. I've got 6 letters there. It's like, and what was remarkable about reading and listening to his voice in the letters is he's exactly who I thought he was going to be. Having known, extrapolating from my grandfather and from his brothers and sisters, I could get a sense of who he was. But that just reinforced it all. And at one point, John writes in this letter to Sophie, who would have been his sister-in-law, he writes, it's December now of 1943, and he writes, he says, I'm 27 years old now, but this is no kind of life for anybody. He says, you need to be 17, to handle what's been going down here for us. He says, I feel like I've aged 30 years. I feel more like I'm 57 than 27. It's a young man's game. And you can hear the weariness in his voice, because this is a guy, his job on the Plunkett, when he wasn't down in the fire room, he was a water tender, took care of the ship's boilers, made the steam. At general quarters, he's in one of those gun tubs. So this is a guy, he's not only in the gun tub, he's not a loader or a handler, but he's a gunner on a 20 millimeters. It means he's in there, he's got the strap on. When the torpedo bombers are coming in, it's John Gallagher on this gun with 2 guys huddled on him. And these guys are moving together, to take out, if they can, these these planes. So I'm going to leave out the whole Anzio. The battle at Anzio, I think, is maybe 50 or 60 pages in the book, which is a long, but there was just so much to say about this remarkable battle at Anzio. In fact, this stuff right here is ACAC. It's anti-aircraft fire. And this is, Frank Gallagher goes over there. He's got a camera. And he's taking pictures all along. He's got some amazing pictures. Frank later was a medic and was part of the Allied force, the 42nd Army, that liberated Dachau. They were the first guys into Dachau. Frank is one of the first guys into Dachau. And he was trying to say, he says, we were losing people at 200 a day, when they came in there because of the malnourishment. And Frank, later in life, he was invited to Jewish times, as he called them, all over Boston. And nothing used to get his goat the way, people who denied the Holocaust, because he was there. He saw the whole thing. So he took pictures in Dachau. and he took pictures, he took this picture at Anzio, because at Anzio, between 12 and 14 German bombers came down on the Plunkett, and nearly 100 came down on the beachhead at Anzio. Very quickly, what happened was 36,000 men were landed. I talked in the beginning about that task force that assembled in Naples. Well, they brought 36,000 men. They landed at Anzio Nettuno. It was a milk run. Nobody, there wasn't much resistance initially. But the day after, the Germans mounted a counter-assault, and they had 100 planes coming down. So while the Plunkett is catching it from 12 to 14, there are 100 on the beachhead. And this is anti-aircraft fire that the Allies are shooting up because they're just getting pummeled. Offshore, of course, for 25 minutes, the Plunkett went toe-to-toe with 12 different bombers. And that's why it was the most harrowing engagement. I mean, they just never let up until what happened. But in the meantime, Plunkett got, for sure, was able to take out 2 of the planes, probably got a 3rd. And it's right there in the report from the squadron commander. 2 of the gunners on the starboard side of the ship on the 20 millimeters, John Gallagher and Bill Alverson, got a 4th plane, and that was something else we never knew. But I remember reading that, and then I read it in Jim Phelps's journal that Gallagher and Alverson got a plane too. So all sorts of revelations. I will just leave you with, that's a little bit of what happened to the Plunkett at Anzio. And I guess I'll circle back to Frank Gallagher and about how often he told that story. And I kind of think, this will be a story I'm telling for a long time too. And I think one of the reasons, it occurred to me at some point that one of the reasons Frank may have told that story over and over again his whole life is because, as with Faulkner in Intruders in the Dust, Faulkner is writing about the Civil War. Say what you will about the Southern cause, the lost cause. I mean, there's a lot of hooey as far as I'm concerned. But there was a certain, those poor white boys. They sort of that lost cause was important to them, and the Southerners who had been in the war. And Faulkner wrote in this story that in every Southern boy's heart, it's July 3rd, 1863. Something, and Pickett hasn't gone in yet, because it was Pickett's charge that ended it for the South at Gettysburg, because the North overwhelmed them there. And so the Southern boys always go back to that because there's still hope. And I think that one of the reasons that Frank told that story over and over again about Naples is because every time he told that story, he brought his brother back to life, because John wasn't dead yet, John was that kid in the gun tub who was leaning over and saying to one of the guys, one of the handlers, "That looks like my brother." And that laugh that Frank had, he always laughed in the same place when he told that story, because he just brought his brother back to life. And that's what, in some ways, I think about this book as a meditation on storytelling, because that's what stories do. They allow you to bring something back to life. Resurrection is a powerful thing, right? It can sustain a people for a long time, resurrection. And I think that's what Frank's story did. And I feel like it was a privilege for me to save it all here. So now these guys are going to be on a shelf for a while. So thank you for coming out. And did I keep it to an hour? Is it?
Great, that's fine.
All right, very good.
Want to take a few questions?
Yeah. Or you can just ask me later.
Can you tell the story about Jim Phelps asking you why Uncle John was buried in?
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Jim, he always talks about that. In fact, I talked to him last Sunday, and he's doing well. There was one thing that Jim Phelps, that bothered him. Jim Phelps on the Plunkett was, he worked with John. He was an engineer on the ship, just like John was. They were both firemen. That's what they were technically known as. And then they became water tenders. And they were each chief petty officers. John, when he was killed, was a chief petty officer. And there were several grades of that. But Jim was in the bunk right below John for a year and a half. I mean, that's how close they were. And so he got really close. This was one of his best friends, and they were close. And when John was killed, he was buried in Palermo first, and then he was buried in Anzio, at the Rome, Sicily American Military Cemetery. It's an incredibly beautiful cemetery, the most beautiful cemetery I've ever seen. And John's mother, who was a widow, didn't bring him home. And the reason was because she had taken a shock, and the doctor said that learning that her son had been killed almost killed her. And they said, look, if you bring him home, she may not make it. And so the brothers and sisters decided, when they found out about the Rome, Sicily cemetery, that he'd be buried there. And he was buried there. And Jim, knowing, once he said to me, the thing you got to understand about John Gallagher is he didn't have an enemy on that ship. He was one of those kinds of guys. And so John, understanding that about John, couldn't understand why he wasn't brought home. And he, for decades, he wondered that. And it was the one thing that he just couldn't ever reconcile. And so when I called him that day, I don't know how it was, he very quickly asked me, he said, Jim, your great uncle, is he still buried over in Italy? And I said, yeah, he's still there. And I could hear the disappointment in his voice, but I knew already why. And I told him. And the relief that he felt in knowing that, because it made all the sense in the world to him. And he, to this day, and if he didn't tell me last Sunday, he told me, last month, that I'm so glad you told me that about John, because he said that just bothered me to no end for 70 years. And he says, now I know. And he says, now I can go. And I don't have to think about that anymore. So, yeah. So, anyway.
Nice.
Yeah. So, there it is. That's the Plunkett. Read the book. Send me an email. Thank you for coming. Well, thanks again, Diane. It's a great space.
That was great.
Yeah, let's do it again.